You have to find Buttons. Those 6 words were written in my mother's will as if they were a legal command and a private prayer at the same time. I read them in the dim light of the probate office, the paper cold under my fingers, and the ink no older than the afternoon the lawyer handed me the envelope. My name was there too, precise and inevitable. I am Claire Donovan, daughter, executor by default, and, for reasons the document did not explain, the only person trusted to obey a strange request that tied the entire estate to a dog that had vanished 30 years ago. 2 days after the funeral, with the smell of lilies still clinging to my coat and the soft hum of fluorescent lights in the hallway behind me, I held a wax-sealed envelope that contained more than an instruction. Inside was a single photo, worn at the edges, Buttons sitting on my mother Madeline's lap, tongue out, eyes sharp as if guarding some invisible treasure. There was also a key sewn into the lining of the envelope, a brass key so small it looked like it belonged to a music box. The lawyer, Mr. Halpert, adjusted his glasses, lowered his voice, and said, "I have to tell you, Mrs. Donovan, there is a clause. The bequest is conditional. Find the dog. Deliver the dog to the address listed, and the estate is yours. Fail, and portions are redirected to a trust I was never told about." The sentence landed like ice. A trust, a redirection, and a line that ended with, "By no means contact Victor or his agents." That last sentence was underlined in blue ink. Victor was my brother. In the car on the ride home, the key burned a tiny copper warmth against my palm. I thought of Buttons as the old dog with a crooked ear we had when I was 8. I thought of the way Mom used to hum when she hung laundry, the way she hid letters in the Bible, the small safe under her bed that I once couldn't open. I turned the envelope over and over. The key did not jingle. It was quiet, dense, as if it had been waiting decades in the dark. Outside, the city slid past with the wet breath of rain on pavement, neon blurred into pools. I smelled diesel, coffee, the faint plastic of the takeout box on the passenger seat, and suddenly the past felt like a scent I could follow. Buttons had disappeared the week my parents announced they would sell the old property on the outskirts of town. I had been away finishing grad school, and the memory in my head was a rumor of a dog who had run off and never come back. I had not thought of him since childhood. My mother had. The first obstacle arrived before I could even get the car out of the parking lot. At 10:17 a.m., my phone buzzed that was both casual and thinly veiled. "Claire," he said, "keep it smooth. Mom was clear. The family will cooperate." There was a polite pause, and then an edge. "Whatever you find, do not make a scene." My chest tightened. Victor had always been good at making things small by controlling the language around them. He was the kind of sibling who smiled at funerals and filed claims before the flowers wilted. The funeral had been a balance between tears and calculations. People had hugged me and offered condolences, but I watched hands slip into pockets with a practiced economy that suggested that grief and ledger could be managed side by side. In the parlor, under the photograph of a younger Madeline smiling with Buttons at her feet, I saw the future being negotiated in glances. The will was explicit about the mechanics. It was signed, notarized, and it referenced an addendum video. The lawyer told me there were video files stored on a password-protected laptop and a backup flash drive. I remember the sound of the laptop being placed on the oak desk in Mr. Halpert's office. The case clicked, the screen glowed, and then I saw my mother on video, older than in the photo, but with the same quick hands. Her voice was steady. "Claire," she said, as if she were speaking to me across the kitchen table, "if you are watching this, it means I am gone or about to be. You will not understand why I asked you to find Buttons. He is not just a dog. He holds something I could not trust to a bank or to the family." When I heard those words, a cold current went through me. The footage smelled faintly of mothballs and warmed tea in the way a memory smells. She continued, "There is a collar, a tin, a flash drive sewn into Button's collar. The key I gave you is for the safety deposit box in the downtown vault, number 312. That small box holds the deed to the little property on Old Mill Road and a packet of papers that explain everything. Buttons will lead you to the truth, and only you can follow him without invoking Victor. I paused the video with my thumb trembling and the cut of room light on my thumbnail. She had made a plan to route choices with the precision of someone who had seen the slow erosion of trust in the family and had decided to hide an ember instead of leaving a burning house to chance. I drove to the place on Old Mill Road with a map that smelled like toner and the photo of Buttons on the passenger seat. There is a particular smell to autumn on country roads: wet hay, damp earth, exhaust, the metallic sharpness that comes right before dusk. I stopped at the crest of a hill and saw what was left of the cottage my parents had kept, a folded house with moss on the shingles and the paint flaking like old skin. The gate sagged. The porch had a chair with a blanket draped over it, and in the distance the creek tinkled like someone turning a small glass bell. I felt, all at once, reverence and trespass. The first sensory image I register was the sound of Buttons barking and the scent of him, a dry animal smell mixed with lavender that had once been on my mother's scarf. His fur was thinner than in the photograph, his ears knotted with small scars. He came to me with the kind of glee that made my throat tight. In his collar was indeed a small tin, rusty at the seam, and inside the tin was a thumb drive wrapped in waxed paper and a tiny brass key that matched the one from the lawyer. The collar also had a charm with an inscription that read, "Vestigia Veritatis," Footprints of Truth. I had the flash drive in my pocket and the will open on the back seat like a map of obligations. That was the first major turn, the first reel of evidence. Inside the flash drive were video diaries my mother had recorded in private over the last 5 years of her life. They were titled with dates and small notations, for Claire only, not for family, not for lawyers. The first file began with the sound of a kettle and her sitting at the table, the window behind her fogged with rain. She explained that in the 70s she had signed away a portion of the family land to a consortium negotiating mineral rights. There had been exchanges of money and promises, contracts that on paper looked tidy, but in practice had siphoned resource rights without the community's informed consent. She had discovered discrepancies in deeds, irregular signatures in notarial records, transfers listed under shell entities, and names that matched the relatives who now sat in front rows at her funeral. As she narrated, she held up receipts, maps, and a list of names. The camera captured the creak of paper and the scrub of her pen. She confessed she had kept the ledger under Button's collar when things got dangerous. "Some days I thought to myself, he is only a dog," she said, "but sometimes a dog is safer than a bank." The files contained specific instructions. Visit the county registrar. Request copies of deeds from 1976 to 1990. Pay attention to folio 442. There is a footnote on page 3 that points to a sealed affidavit. I wrote a map of where the physical proof is buried. Follow Buttons to the old birch that leans like an apologetic head, and dig 1 foot to the right of its roots. There is a tin labeled for Claire. I did exactly as she asked. I recruited a few allies, people my mother had trusted once and who still carried the kind of loyalty that felt heavier than a paycheck. Ellis was a retired groundskeeper who had worked on the property for 20 years. He smelled of sawdust and leather and kept a pocket knife the size of small history. Mara, the veterinarian who had treated Buttons since he was a puppy, came with biohazard gloves and an empathy that turned practical. Jonah was an archivist at the county courthouse who trusted me because my mother had once saved his son a scholarship by recommending him for a position. There was also Lena, my neighbor, and a woman with a fierce appetite for truth who could get the tone of people's emails before they sent them. I named them to be clear because they each did something crucial. Ellis dug the hole with hands that trembled in places I could not. Mara read the vet records and found annotations that suggested Buttons had been microchipped at a clinic 2 towns away under a false name. Jonah filed the request for the sealed affidavit, and Lena scoured public filings for the shell companies registered in my brother Victor's name. The list of helpers extended to characters I met along the way. Officer Ramos, who remembered Madeline as a woman of exacting standards. Father Dominic, who had given my mother last rites and also a ledger for the church renovations. And Casey at the downtown vault, who handled box 312 with the discretion of someone who had once seen the worst of secrets. These men and women became a chorus in which each voice had a particular action and consequence. My backstory is important because this task was not just about finding a dog. I grew up in a house organized by ritual and silence. My mother, Madeline, was meticulous. She sewed, she labeled, she cataloged birthdays with a precision that bordered on devotion. She taught me how to read maps before I could tie my shoes. I studied literature, then law, then I stepped away to write for a while until life required a steadier income, and I became a paralegal at a small firm. I had expected to inherit procedural patience more than treasure. My father loved numbers and the smell of engine oil. He laughed with his entire body and taught me how to listen to machines. When he died, the estate was handled cleanly. There were no strange clauses, no dogs to find. When my mother told me she had secrets, I thought they were moral ones, confessions in late-night cups of tea. But she had kept more than confessions. She had hoarded evidence and distributed keys like breadcrumbs. As a daughter, I felt the weight of guilt for not having been there the night Buttons escaped. As an executor, I felt the push of duty and the legal obligations that sat like a ledger on my shoulders. In private, late at night, I replayed my mother's voice and tried to forgive myself for the years I had prioritized career and distance over the small domestic accounts of trust between parent and child. This backstory of absence and eventual responsibility mattered because it positioned me as both heir and outsider, someone who loved the woman but also stood apart enough to obey instructions that were eccentric by family standards. The antagonist, my brother Victor, was not a cartoonishly evil man. He was methodical and implacable. He had been the CEO of a regional development firm, his suits always purchased by someone who understood the optics of power. He had polished charm, but a ledger for everything. Victor was the type to arrange meetings in executive suites where coffee was too hot and contracts were colder. He had served on boards, he knew the language of property, and he was fluent in the art of plausible deniability. His backstory is less sentimental and more of a calculated climb. He took the family business and trimmed its edges until profit shone through. People liked him because he seemed decisive, because he could smile and include you in a plan so you felt like part of the victory. When disputes arose, he had a network of accountants and attorneys who could turn messy facts into tidy footnotes. He was not cruel in private. He was pragmatist. He would tell you a truth if it served his purpose and remain silent when silence benefited him more. That combination made him dangerous for someone like my mother, who believed in moral accounts and had started to fear that the family ledger had been doctored. Victor was implicated by signatures that matched his assistants, by transfers to entities with addresses on the same street as his consultancy, and by the fact that he had called the day after my mother died to ask if I was following her instructions. In his actions he was precise, implacable, and legally agile, and that is what made the coming confrontation less dramatic in sound and more devastating in consequence. We found more than the 10. Under the birch roots, the earth smelled of wet leaves, loam, and something metallic that could have been rust or blood. Ellis dug with a gloved hand and pulled out a container that rattled like old coins. Inside were documents wrapped in oilcloth, a deed with signatures and a chain of custody that indicated a transfer had been recorded but later voided, and a small ledger with entries that matched bank withdrawals in times when the family claimed austerity. There were minutes from meetings of a consortium negotiating mineral rights, names redacted with a black marker, but still legible in the photocopies my mother had preserved. The sensory images are vivid. The grit under my nails, the sound of old paper unfolding like the flapping of tired wings, the metallic smell of the tiny tin, the taste of salt at the back of my throat when I realized how long this had been hidden. I sat with the documents at my kitchen table under a lamp that hummed and watched Buttons sleep like a guard over the paper. Mara cleaned Button's paws and found beneath the fur a faint remnant of oil that matched the refinery signature on one of the invoices. Jonah traced a notarized record to a clerk who remembered a hurried filing and had a receipt stamped with a time that matched Victor's schedule the week of the transfer. This was the beginning of a larger uncovering. The legal process that followed required technical explanations. Probate law required filing the will, inventorying assets, and notifying beneficiaries. Contesting heir claims involved serving notices, filing an objection with the court, and proving undue influence or fraud. A critical procedural step was obtaining certified copies of deeds and the sealed affidavit Madeline had referenced. This involved a request to the county registrar, a verification of original signatures by a notary public, and in some cases a forensic document examination to compare ink and pressure patterns. Each action had a cost and a time. I will explain one technical procedure here briefly to make sense of what followed. To contest a transfer of mineral rights, an attorney must demonstrate chain of title irregularities by producing certified copies of deeds, corroborating bank transfers that conflict with recorded sales, and affidavits from witnesses who can attest to the circumstances of the signature. These materials are then submitted to the civil court, where a judge will decide on injunctive relief pending a full hearing. That is the skeleton of the legal path we took, and it required evidence, timelines, and witnesses who could corroborate Madeline's statements. Pressure built quickly. Victor did not waste time. He sent emissaries who arrived in polite suits and sharper smiles. He instructed attorneys to file motions to remove me as executor on grounds I was unfit, citing my distance from the family and supposed conflicts of interest. He produced a doctor letter suggesting Mom had been of unsound mind in the months before her death. The motions smelled of a strategy. Make the inheritance process messy enough so that the conditional bequest defaulted to the trust. Against that, my allies moved. Mara supplied medical records that confirmed Madeline had signed documents lucidly. Jonah tracked down a clerk who verified the receipt stamps on the contested deeds, and Casey at the vault confirmed the authenticity of the physical deed in box 312. Our first major confrontation unfolded in a conference room, where paper and posture were weapons. Victor sat across from me with a smile that was too easy. He said, "Why dig up ghosts? This is a negotiation, Claire. Hand over the deed and we divide the assets." He used the word "we" as an umbrella for his ambitions. I responded, "My mother left instructions. She wanted me to find Buttons and follow what he carried." He laughed softly and said, "You could be on a wild goose chase, but I prefer to think of you as sentimental." The room smelled of stale coffee and lemon cleaner. The carpet hummed under the weight of words. I felt small and enormous at the same time. That confrontation escalated into a public moment when Victor filed a motion in civil court to compel an inventory and to seek temporary control of the property pending resolution. The court date was a powder keg. We prepared exhibits: the flash drive with the video files, notarized copies of the will, certified copies of the deed, and sworn affidavits from Ellis and Jonah. On the morning of the hearing, the air smelled of rain and printer toner. The courtroom was a box with rows of faces who watched like a Greek chorus. Victor arranged his team as if arranging dominoes. His lawyer was a man named Richardson, who spoke in a clipped manner and had a jaw like a hinge. The exchange went on for hours and included a heated dialogue where Mrs. Donovan's video was played. We watched my mother speak, see her hands as she passed the ledger to the camera, and heard her say, "Claire, protect the land." That moment changed the room. You could have heard a pin drop. Victor rose, voice cool, and questioned the admissibility of a self-recorded video as hearsay. Richardson cited precedent and argued that because the video carried instructional content relevant to the distribution of assets, and because it was referenced in the will, it held probative value. The judge agreed to admit the video as an evidentiary exhibit, and the court ordered a temporary injunction preventing the transfer of the contested mineral rights until a full hearing. The legal jargon was dense and deliberate, but the practical consequence felt simple and enormous. For now, the land could not be sold. Just when I believed the judicial system would be the final arbiter, more secrets surfaced. There were moments when Buttons itself became a source of evidence that could be read like a ledger. In the dog's collar was not only a flash drive, but a tuft of hair threaded through the fabric that contained microfilmed pages. The microfilm was small enough to have been created by someone with access to preservation equipment. Jonah recognized the type. It matched the style used in a historical society archive. We realized my mother had placed copies in ways she thought would survive human interference: in a dog, under a tree, and in an old safety deposit box. Buttons also led us to the abandoned shed at the back of the property, where my mother had stored paintings and journals. The shed smelled of sawdust, linseed oil, and the stale sweetness of turpentine. There I found a canvas with a map painted on its back, little X's that matched coordinates in the flash drive instructions. That map pointed to a small outbuilding on the neighbor property, a place I thought contained only old tractors. Inside we found envelopes with coded notes that referenced names and highlighted dates when funds were transferred. The sensory detail of pulling each envelope out was acute. The texture of worn paper, the faint trace of tobacco, the impression of a handwriting I knew without reading. There were at least 3 long tension moments that slowed time and forced choices. The first was the night Victor's men came to the property in the rain. Their headlights pierced through the fog, the growl of their engines a threat. I stood on the porch with Buttons at my feet, mud on my boots, rain dripping like a slow drumbeat. They wanted the key. They said we could make this easier. I told them to leave. One stepped forward. Ellis pushed him with a force that surprised me. We argued. Voices rose. Buttons barked, and a single window somewhere in the house shattered like brittle promise. That scene was visceral. The coppery taste of adrenaline, the smell of wet leather, the sting of cold on my cheek where rain mixed with sweat. I remember feeling the hairs on my forearm lift. In that moment I understood fortitude is not the absence of fear, but the choice to stand with fear anyway. The second tension was the court hearing when Victor questioned Madeline's sanity. Each cross-examination felt like a needle. I listened as private letters were read aloud, words pried from life and used as tools. The third was the night I opened the safety deposit box. The security door clanked, the fluorescent lights buzzed, and Casey slid box 312 across the counter. Inside was a packet with a deed, letters from community members thanking Madeline for exposing a scheme, and a final note from Mom. "Claire, keep this small and give it to those who will protect it." The air tasted of metal and the faint antiseptic of the vault. I wept in the tiny room with the box between my knees. Those 3 moments were fulcrums. Each forced me to choose between surrender and disclosure. Alongside personal drama, there were technical examinations. A forensic analysis of the microfilm and the flash drive confirmed metadata consistent with the dates Madeline had reported. A handwriting expert compared signatures and identified irregularities in a series of transfers. Each technical report was 250 to 350 characters of explanation in court filings, but the essence was that evidence was audited, timestamps verified, and chain of title inconsistencies documented. For example, the microchip registration indicated a clinic timestamp that matched a transfer unrelated to the sale record. Combined with the bank withdrawal ledgers we had, the pattern suggested an attempt to divert funds that should have been disclosed in the deed process. The forensic notes were dry and clinical, but crucial. They turned suspicion into a plausible narrative that a judge could consider. The turning point came when a neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, gave a sworn statement describing a night in 1982, when she saw men unloading drums marked with a corporate seal near the creek on Old Mill Road. Her memory, vivid and sensory, described the smell of oil, the way the moonlight glinted on a can of red paint, and the muffled voice of a man who sounded like Victor. Her affidavit, combined with the ledger entries and the video files, formed a mosaic. The courtroom became a stage where private memory clashed with public record. Victor attempted to paint my mother as vengeful, a woman whose recollection had been sharpened by nostalgia. But the pattern of ink, stamps, and witness testimony folded his defenses. In a long afternoon of deliberation, the judge issued a ruling that favored our motion for preliminary injunctive relief and ordered an independent audit of the contested transactions. Victor looked stunned, as if a carefully stacked house of cards had found a gust it could not survive. The resolution was not cinematic. There were no dramatic arrests in the courthouse. Instead, there were negotiations, mediated sessions, and a settlement that balanced restitution with practical realities. The company involved agreed to a remediation fund for the community in exchange for relinquishing certain claims on mineral rights and placing enforcement clauses that required public oversight. Legally, we obtained a partial victory. The deed was recognized as having been altered, certain transfers were rescinded, and a trust was established to manage the remediation funds and to preserve the land. Victor accepted a negotiated settlement that provided him with liquid assets in exchange for stepping back from direct control of the property. The sensory aftermath of the agreement was the smell of coffee and paper and cologne in a conference room where someone handed me a folder labeled "Settlement." I felt light and hollow in alternating measures. There were consequences to the choices made. Victor and I did not reconcile fully. He offered practical apologies in the form of signed documents and the occasional text that read like legal bulletins. He attended family events with the composure of a man who had resolved his business. I felt ambiguous about him. I recognized that he acted as he had been trained to act in the world, but could not absolve the times his actions had caused harm. The people who helped me were acknowledged in a quiet ceremony where we planted a birch and embroidered a plaque with my mother's name. Ellis received compensation for his years of service. Mara opened a small clinic for rescue animals funded by a portion of the remediation. Jonah published an article in the Regional Historical Review detailing the case. Lena organized community meetings to ensure the trust did what it promised. Casey retired not long after and sent a letter with a photograph of Box 312 that had been returned to our custody. I named each person because legacy is not solitary. The deed had been preserved, the community received restitution, and Buttons lived out his days under the care of Ellis until he passed and was buried under the birch where we had first dug up the tin. There is a scene I treasure. That is both simple and sacred. Me, sitting in the grass, feeling Buttons' earth warm where he lay, the scent of pine and wet soil, the sun on my face, as if my mother had written permission into the weather. There is an intimate moral complication that tested my ethics. In a private moment, I discovered a letter from Madeline addressed to Victor that suggested she had known his involvement but had chosen not to publicize it in hope that family would self-regulate. The letter contained a request that stirred my conscience. Do not ruin him if he can be made to repair the harm. I had to decide whether to press criminal charges or to accept a civil settlement that guaranteed community remediation. In the end, I followed my mother's counsel, which was both merciful and pragmatic. I refused to pursue criminal prosecution and instead ensured oversight, restitution, and transparency. That choice angered some community members who wanted retribution and comforted others who feared the ruinous consequences of criminal trials. The choice was both legal and deeply personal. In the decision, I saw my mother desire to mend rather than to punish, to place legacy into the hands of the living who could care for it. That is a moral complication I still reflect on. The climax was less a single explosive moment and more a sequence of legal and social triumphs. We removed the cloud from the property title. The independent audit validated the irregularities. The consortium offered restitution. Victor accepted terms. The settlement created a community oversight board, funded environmental remediation, and established a small endowment for restoration of the property and to create an educational center that taught sustainable land use. We secured a deed that has clear record and a notarial entry that closed the contested chapter. In the quiet aftermath of legal closure, friends and neighbors came to the property for a day of restoration. The air smelled of sawdust and bread, of coffee and wet grass. We hung a small plaque that read, "Keep the land safe for the people," in memory of Madeline. I felt as if we had both honored her and restructured the family ledger into something less predatory. The epilogue unfolds in 3 distinct moments. 1 month later, I returned to the cottage and found that the wood stove had been repaired, that Button's collar lay folded on the mantel, and that the lender for the educational center had sent a letter of intent. The air smelt of lemon and oil. I walked the creek and saw the water move like a thread, pulling a long seam through the land. That month was about practicalities. Bank accounts were settled, the trust paperwork was filed, and we convened the first meeting of the oversight board. I wrote minutes in a notebook my mother once used and felt the ordinary rhythm of work replace the adrenaline of discovery. 3 months later, the Restoration Fund had committed to a cleanup on contaminated soil and had hired local workers led by Ellis and a small environmental firm. We planted seedlings along the creek. There were press articles and interviews. I found myself speaking about responsibility and legacy in spaces I never anticipated. The smell then was of sap and new wood, and the taste of black coffee with a hint of relief. 6 months after the ruling, the Educational Center announced its curriculum, focusing on land stewardship and community rights. We opened the doors with a small ceremony. Children from town visited and sat on hay bales. I walked down the aisle and saw faces of people whose names had once been footnotes in my mother ledger. The property hummed with new uses: workshops, garden plots, lecture series. In private letters, people wrote to say that the remediation funds had helped medical bills and that a small grant had preserved a family business. Those letters smelled of ink and gratitude, and sometimes sorrow. In the end, the will that said I had to find my mother-long-lost dog was less about obedience to a whim and more about honoring a method of protection my mother trusted. Buttons carried a secret like a talisman, and my mother entrusted me with following the trail she had laid, a trail stitched together with keys, videos, tins, and the steady logic of a woman who believed that truth could be planted in the most unlikely of places. The estate paperwork now sits in my filing cabinet, safe and indexed, with deed copies, the trust agreement, and the audited reports from the independent firm. I learned that legacy is both a legal artifact and a living practice. I lost a mother, and in following her final instruction, I found a community and a way to reframe our family story. If you are watching this story and it touches you, leave a comment about what you would do if your loved one asked something unusual in their will. Would you follow the odd instruction or respect a promise they made to themselves? Share your thought if you are here because stories like these remind us that the smallest objects sometimes hold the largest truths. If you want to support these deep dives into family secrets and legal untangling, consider subscribing. We will return to this property later to show the educational program in action, to trace the environmental remediation, and to interview the people who helped turn a private bequest into public repair. For now, I will close with gratitude to those who stood with me. Ellis, who dug when my hands would not. Mara, who kept Buttons healthy and patient. Jonah, who rooted through dusty archives. Lena, who organized our outreach. Casey, who guarded the vault with quiet dignity. And Father Dominic, who offered a space of solace. Madeline left us more than property. She left a path to repair. Buttons will rest under the birch, and his collar will be preserved in the Educational Center, as a reminder that sometimes a dog can be a witness and a guardian of truth. The small key now lives on the ribbon my mother kept in her sewing kit, a token of a life that measured love in keys and quiet instructions.